Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. The day we moved into our new apartment in Columbus, Ohio, I met Diane for the first time while carrying boxes up the stairs. She must have been in her mid-50s, with hair dyed a reddish-brown shade, though her gray roots were already showing. She wore an oversized cardigan, even though it was nearly 80 degrees Fahrenheit that day. She stood at her doorway watching us as we carried in the furniture. When my girlfriend Amy and I passed her with the couch, Diane stepped out holding a plate of cookies. "Welcome to the building," she said in a raspy voice, the kind that reveals decades of cigarettes. The cookies were store-bought, still in their plastic packaging, but she had carefully arranged them on a ceramic plate decorated with small roses. I remember thinking it was a sweet gesture, an older woman living alone, trying to make us feel welcome. She told us she'd been living there for 12 years, that she knew all the neighbors, and that if we ever needed anything, her door was always open. During the first week, Diane knocked on our door almost every day. At first, she only asked for small favors, to reach something from a high shelf, to check her remote control because it wasn't working, or to help her get her cat, Mr. Whiskers, out from under the bed. Amy and I didn't mind. We were young, healthy, and deep down, we felt sorry for her. Diane mentioned that her daughter lived in California and hardly ever visited, and that her son had died in a motorcycle accident 5 years ago. Her apartment had photographs of a younger Diane with her 2 children at different stages, but the pictures stopped abruptly around 2010. Her home smelled of cat litter and those plug-in air fresheners that claimed to smell like ocean breeze but really just smell like chemicals. Every surface was covered with crocheted or lace doilies, and an entire shelf was occupied by a collection of porcelain angels, where books should have been. About 3 weeks after we'd settled in, Diane's requests started getting bigger. First, she needed a ride to the grocery store because her car was in the shop. Then she asked for a lift to the pharmacy, and later, to a doctor's appointment on the other side of town, right during my lunch break. She always appeared at the exact right moment, standing in her doorway, wearing that same cardigan, clutching her purse with both hands. "I hate to bother you, sweetheart, but," she always began. And of course, it was never a coincidence. By then, she already knew our schedules by heart. When we left for work, when we got back, even when we did laundry on Sunday afternoons. Amy started using the back door to avoid her, but I felt too guilty. One morning, Diane asked to borrow $40 to pay for medication, promising to return it when her Social Security check arrived. Then it was $60 for groceries, and later $100 because of a bank issue that had delayed her rent payment. The other neighbors started warning us about her around the second month. One night, while I was waiting for the dryer to finish, Gerald, the neighbor from 3B, a tall, thin man who worked nights at the hospital and rarely spoke to anyone, said, "So she got you too, huh?" It wasn't really a question. He explained that Diane had done the same thing to the previous tenants of our apartment, a young couple like us who had lasted only 8 months before breaking the lease. The ones before them lasted 6. Gerald had lived in the building for 4 years and had learned never to open the door for her. "She has a way of making you feel like a monster if you don't help her," he said, folding his uniforms with tense movements. "She knows exactly what she's doing. She picks the young ones, the kind ones, the ones who grew up believing you should respect your elders." According to Gerald, she had extracted almost $300 from the previous couple, with excuses about waiting for a check from insurance or a pension that never came. After that conversation, Amy insisted we stop helping her, and we tried. The next morning when Diane knocked, we didn't answer. She knocked again, harder, then a third time. "I know you're in there," she shouted in a different voice, harsher, sharper than we'd ever heard before. "I can hear you moving. I just need a quick ride to the bank." We stayed silent, barely breathing, until she finally left. But that same afternoon when we returned from work, we found her sitting on the stairs in front of our apartment. She had her cardigan pulled tightly around her and her eyes were swollen. She looked up at us with real tears rolling down her cheeks. "My cat is sick. I can't afford the vet," she said, trembling as she wiped her eyes with a tissue. Amy walked past without saying a word, but I stopped. I couldn't help it. Mr. Whiskers had looked perfectly fine the last time I saw him, but what if he really was sick? What if this time she actually needed help? That night I gave her $80 for the vet, and Amy barely spoke to me afterward. She said I was feeding her manipulation, that Diane was pulling my strings like a puppet, and she was probably right. But the problem with manipulation is that even when you know you're being controlled, even when you can see the strings clearly, sometimes you still can't stop moving to their rhythm. Diane had that talent. She made her problems feel urgent, immediate, catastrophes that only you could fix. She would hunch over, make herself small, fragile, and you'd forget everything. The borrowed money, Gerald's warnings, the way she timed every emergency to trap you at the worst possible moment. 2 days later, I saw Mr. Whiskers in her window, perfectly healthy, grooming himself in the sunlight. When I mentioned it, Diane smiled and said the medicine had worked wonderfully, but she didn't meet my eyes when she said it. By the 3rd month, things started to spiral out of control. Diane began showing up at odd hours, always with new tragic, urgent stories. One night, she claimed her nephew in Michigan needed emergency surgery and that she had to send money immediately. Another day, she said her ex-husband was threatening to sue her over an old debt. Then she said the building management had warned she'd be evicted on Friday if she didn't pay her overdue rent. Each crisis came with a new amount, $200, $300, sometimes $500. By that point, I had already given her nearly $600 in total, and Amy had reached her limit. That night, we had a huge argument, the kind that leaves wounds hard to heal. Amy accused me of caring more about a manipulative woman than about our own life together. She reminded me of our plans, saving for a house, building a future, and said I was throwing it all away, turning myself into a guilt-ridden ATM. She slept on the couch that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my heart heavy, wondering how I had let things get so far. The next morning, a crisp Saturday in late September, the air had that fresh autumn smell. As I brewed coffee, I heard Diane's voice through the wall. She was on the phone, laughing, but not her weak, trembling laugh. A real one, strong, carefree. No, the couple next door are a good source," she said clearly. "Young professionals, you know the type. Can't stand to see an old lady suffer." She laughed again, and then I heard her mention something about already having enough for the cruise deposit. Amy was standing behind me, listening too. We stayed silent as Diane continued, mocking, describing how she had devised the perfect system. She kept a notebook with detailed records of what she'd told each person so her stories wouldn't overlap. She referred to us by apartment number, not by name. We were just entries in her ledger, pieces in her game. Amy grabbed her phone and started recording, pressing it against the wall to capture her voice. After that, we stopped answering the door, no matter how much she knocked. Sometimes we'd hear her outside, pounding for 20 or 30 minutes straight, each time harder. She slipped notes under the door, long, desperate letters accusing us of being cruel, heartless, of having betrayed her trust. One of those letters said she knew where we worked, knew our car, and the names of our families from the mail she'd seen. It wasn't exactly a threat, but it wasn't not one either. Gerald told us she'd done the same thing to other neighbors who had cut her off. Eventually, she always found new tenants to manipulate, and she did. 2 weeks later, a young woman named Beth moved into apartment 4A, and we watched as Diane shifted her attention to her, like a predator choosing new prey. We tried to warn her, but Diane had gotten there first. She had told Beth that the other tenants hated her, that they made up lies because they were intolerant of older people. When we tried to explain the truth, Beth looked at us with suspicion. It was already too late. Diane had won the first battle. October turned into November, and by then we had learned to live by avoiding Diane. We knew her routine. When she got the mail, when she wandered the halls looking for conversation, when she sat in the lobby pretending to wait for someone. The building had a constant tension, a silent kind of anxiety that hung in the air. We weren't the only ones. The Guans from 2C said Diane had taken $400 from them before they realized the scam. The old man from 1A just laughed when he heard her name, a bitter, resigned laugh. But no one moved out. Breaking a lease was expensive, and somehow we'd all convinced ourselves we could endure her, that if we were stronger, she'd get bored and leave. Until that night in mid-November. It was a Thursday around 11. I was brushing my teeth when I heard the sirens, first distant, then closer, until they stopped right in front of our building. The flashing red and blue lights reflected on the bathroom walls. Amy and I went to the living room window. Outside were 3 police cars, then 4, and finally an ambulance. Neighbors started coming out of their apartments, many still in pajamas, robes, or hastily thrown on sweatshirts. We crowded into the hallway, watching as 2 officers knocked on Diane's door. They knocked once, then harder, until announcing themselves as police. When she finally opened, she was wearing the same old cardigan, but her face was different. Calm, empty, almost as if she already knew they were there for her. They told her she had to come with them to answer some questions. She nodded, offering no resistance, and walked down the hallway as we all watched. Her eyes passed over each neighbor, one by one, without a trace of emotion, as if we were strangers she had never seen before. Gerald stood beside me and whispered, "Her brother, the one in Portland, they found him dead 2 days ago." The word poisoning started floating among the hallway murmurs, along with phrases like brother's insurance and power of attorney. Someone mentioned that Diane had visited him the previous month, right after his cancer diagnosis. The detective who came to question us the next day wouldn't confirm anything but asked a lot about her stories, her money, the time she'd asked for help, the lies she'd told about her family. After that night, we never saw her again. A week later, they emptied her apartment. The men doing it wore protective suits, as if entering a contaminated site. The smell that came out when they opened the door was indescribable, heavy, nauseating. They found dozens of notebooks, the same ones she had once mentioned, filled with meticulous records of every interaction with the tenants. There was my name, with notes about my weaknesses. Catholic guilt, sensitive to sad stories. Amy's name appeared too, with a note that said, "Difficult, requires persistence." Later, management told us Diane had never been behind on her rent. She had plenty of money in her accounts. Everything, the pleas, the tears, the emergencies, the tales of tragedy, had been part of a game. Maybe she did it to feel powerful, or maybe for the simple pleasure of manipulation. A few months later, we received a letter saying the case was still ongoing, but we never found out how it ended. Amy and I moved out when our lease expired, to another neighborhood far away where no one knew us. Since then, we've been more cautious, more distrustful, quicker to notice when someone tries to pull invisible strings. Sometimes I still think of Beth, the new girl in 4A. I wonder if she found out the truth before Diane was arrested, or if she kept knocking on an empty apartment door, holding a bag of groceries in her hand, not knowing that no one would ever open it again. Story 2. 2 years ago, I was living in a duplex in Denver with my 8-year-old daughter, Lily. I had just finalized my divorce and was trying to rebuild our lives from scratch. The house wasn't much. The paint on the shutters was peeling. The kitchen looked like it was straight out of the 80s, and the backyard had more weeds than grass. But it was our home, and that was the only thing that really mattered. I worked as a dental hygienist at a clinic downtown, taking long shifts so I could make ends meet. Almost every night I came home exhausted, helped Lily with her homework, made dinner, and collapsed into bed by 10. Life was predictable, routine, and honestly, that was exactly what we needed after the chaos of the previous year. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly older people who had lived there for decades, which made me feel safe as a single mom. Our next-door neighbor, Walter, moved in about 3 months after we did. He looked a little over 50, always dressed in the same faded blue coveralls and a John Deere cap that had seen better days. The first time I met him, he was unloading boxes from an old Ford pickup, and I offered to help. He had a peculiar way of speaking. He never looked you directly in the eyes, but a little past your shoulder, as if something more interesting were happening behind you. His teeth were yellowed, probably from years of coffee and cigarettes, and he had a strange habit. He would click his tongue right before speaking, as if savoring the words. Walter worked the nights at a warehouse on the other side of the city, so we almost never crossed paths. But when we did, he was friendly, always asking about Lily's school or commenting on the weather. Nothing that set off alarms. The borrowing started innocently enough, maybe 6 weeks after Walter moved in. One Saturday afternoon, while Lily was at a friend's birthday party, he knocked on my door. He said he was putting up some shelves, and the head of his hammer had flown off the handle, nearly breaking his kitchen window. I laughed, went to the garage, and lent him mine, telling him to return it whenever. The next morning, he brought it back wrapped in a clean dish towel, as if it were something valuable. Then it was a screwdriver set, then pliers, and later my electric drill. Each time he had an elaborate excuse. The screwdriver had rolled under the fridge and he couldn't reach it. The pliers had gotten mixed into a box he'd already taken to storage. The drill bit had snapped halfway through the project. He was always there, nervously rocking on the porch, that tongue click repeating every few seconds. And although the requests were frequent, he always returned the items, usually within a day or two, sometimes cleaner than when I'd lent them. It was odd, yes, but seemingly harmless. As time went by, the requests became more specific. He needed my measuring tape, but the long one, not the short one he'd seen me use in the yard. He asked for aluminum foil because the one he'd bought tore too easily. He asked for batteries, but only Duracell, because according to him, generic ones didn't last in his flashlight. One July afternoon, he knocked while I was giving Lily a bath. He said his vacuum had sucked up something it shouldn't have and stopped working, so he needed to borrow mine. I remember standing in the doorway, wiping my hands on my jeans, and noticing how he looked past me, into the house. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the living room, as if he were memorizing the layout of the furniture. But I ignored it. I thought maybe he was just curious, or one of those people who don't know how to hide it. 2 days later, he returned the vacuum with a new bag installed and a thank you note taped to the handle. Small gestures that made it hard to suspect anything. By August, his visits were part of my routine. That characteristic knock on the door, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more, had become unmistakable. And almost always behind it, there was another request. But that's when things began to turn unsettling. One Thursday, I came home from work earlier than usual because Lily had a dentist appointment. And when I got home, I noticed something strange. The spare key I kept under the little ceramic toad on the porch was gone. I checked every corner, thinking the wind might have moved it, or that I'd dropped it without realizing. But nothing. It simply wasn't there. That same night, Walter knocked again, this time to ask for some sugar. While I was looking for it in the kitchen, I mentioned the missing key. He immediately offered to help me look for it. He spent 20 minutes on the porch with a flashlight, checking every crack and corner. He didn't find anything, or at least that's what I thought. The next morning, the key was back in its place, exactly under the toad, just where I had left it. When I thanked Walter for finding it, he looked confused. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, that I had probably found it myself and didn't remember. It was a small detail, but something inside me started to feel off. The Saturday that changed everything, Lily was spending the weekend with her dad, and I decided to use the time to deep clean the house. While sorting through my small office, I realized my passport wasn't in the file cabinet where I always kept it. My birth certificate was still there. Lily's too, but the passport had disappeared. I took out all the folders, checked sheet by sheet, even looked behind the furniture thinking it might have fallen. Nothing. Then I started noticing other things out of place. The stack of bank statements, which I always kept clipped together, wasn't in the same order. My Social Security card had been moved. The The folder with Lily's medical records, which I always kept in the third drawer, was now in the second. Small details, almost imperceptible, but I am meticulous to a fault. Since the divorce, I learned that keeping every document in its place was essential for custody paperwork, so I knew exactly how everything should be. I sat on the floor surrounded by papers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My laptop was still on the desk. My jewelry box, untouched in the bedroom. The emergency cash I kept in an old coffee tin was still there. Nothing of value had disappeared, except the passport. But someone without a doubt had been going through my documents. Someone careful, meticulous, who had taken the time to leave everything almost the same, as if they didn't want me to notice. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to tell them? That my papers were out of order? That my passport was missing, but there were no signs of a break-in? I was afraid they'd think I was paranoid. I spent the rest of the afternoon checking every lock and every window, looking for signs of forced entry. Everything was in order. The only possible explanation was that someone had entered with a key, and the only key that had gone missing was the one under the ceramic toad. That night around 7, Walter knocked on the door again. This time he wanted to borrow my folding ladder to change a light bulb in his hallway. He said the ceiling was too high and his ladder didn't reach. I stood in the doorway, studying his face carefully, looking for something, anything, that would confirm my suspicions. In less than 30 seconds, he clicked his tongue 3 times. His eyes kept wandering again and again into my house. But what really chilled my blood was a tiny detail. He had a small cut on his index finger, recent enough that blood was still seeping through the bandage. When I asked what had happened, he laughed and said he'd cut himself opening old mail. I got careless with an envelope, he said, brushing it off. I lent him the ladder, but as soon as he left, I went straight to my office. And there I saw it. One of my bank statement envelopes had a small blood stain on the corner, so tiny I hadn't noticed it before. I felt my whole body go cold. That man had been inside my house, going through my personal documents, touching my things. And now he was standing at my door, talking to me as if nothing had happened. I hardly slept that night. Every creak in the floor, every shadow at the window made me jump. The fear was so real I could feel it under my skin. On Monday, I called in sick and spent the day securing the house. I put new deadbolts on all the doors and added interior chains to the front and back. I bought a security camera system at Best Buy, the kind that sends alerts to your phone when it detects movement. While installing one of the cameras, I discovered something that turned my stomach. In Lily's room behind her dresser, I found one of my pay stubs from 3 months earlier. I knew perfectly well I had never taken it into her room. I always handled those papers in my office. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. On the back of the stub, someone had written in pencil very lightly a series of numbers. Looking closely, I realized it was my work schedule, with the exact days and hours I'd worked that month. Someone had been tracking my routine, knowing exactly when I was out and for how long. The handwriting was small, tight, and it wasn't mine. I took photos of everything with my phone. I finally had something that could be considered real evidence. The next morning, Tuesday, I checked the security camera recordings from the previous night. What I saw confirmed all my suspicions. At 3:47 a.m., Walter appeared on my porch. He stood in front of the door for about 30 seconds, not knocking, not moving, just staring. Then he walked away. At 4:15 a.m., he came back. This time he went to the back door and again stood there, still, watching before leaving again. The footage was crystal clear. In his hand, he was holding something that looked like a key. My entire body froze. I called the police immediately. When the officer arrived, he seemed skeptical. He said that technically Walter hadn't entered the house or done anything illegal. Standing on a porch isn't a crime, he commented, indifferent. He advised me to change all the locks, document everything, and if the situation worsened, to consider a restraining order. As soon as he left, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house changed that same day. I also called my ex-husband to ask him to keep Lily a few more days until I could sort everything out. On Wednesday night, Walter knocked on my door again. I watched him through the peephole but didn't answer. He knocked 3 more times over the course of an hour, waiting about 5 minutes between each attempt. Through the camera app on my phone, I saw him clearly. He was holding a pie tin, presumably as an excuse to talk to me. After the 4th attempt, he left the tin on my porch and went back to his house. But he didn't go in. He sat on the steps of his entryway facing mine and stayed there for 2 full hours, watching, observing, occasionally sipping from a thermos. I called 911 again, but they told me that since he was on his own property, they couldn't do anything. I spent those hours sitting in the dark living room, peeking through the blinds, watching him watch me. Finally, around 10, he went inside his house. The pie tin remained on my porch for 3 days. I never opened it. In the end, I just threw it in the trash. I never spoke to Walter again, but I could feel his gaze every time I came or went. His curtains would shift. His door would crack open just an inch. There was always the sense that he was still watching. I documented everything: photos, notes, videos, dates, times. I ended up with an evidence file nearly 2 inches thick. A month later, my neighbor Mrs. Gutierrez told me Walter had been evicted. The property owner had done a routine inspection and found disturbing things. Inside the house were dozens of photocopied women's IDs taped to the bedroom wall, boxes full of mail that didn't belong to him, and notebooks with detailed records of the schedules and routines of several neighbors. The police got involved, but Walter disappeared before they could question him. Among what they found were my passport in a kitchen drawer and 2 of my credit cards I didn't even know were missing. They also found a kit for making key copies and several blank keys. The detective who called me explained that Walter wasn't his real name. His real identity was Douglas Brennan, and he had a history of identity theft and stalking in 3 different states. 2 weeks later, we moved. Since then, I check my credit report obsessively, double lock every door, and distrust any neighbor who is a little too friendly. Lily never knew the whole story. I only told her we needed a fresh start. Sometimes I wonder how many times he entered our house while we slept, what else he might have touched, or what he might have taken without me noticing. And the truth is, not knowing is almost worse than everything I did discover. Story 3. The 4 of us had been sharing that house in the suburbs of Phoenix for about 8 months when everything went to hell. It was February 2018. I was 26 and worked remotely as a graphic designer. All my housemates, Jason, Maria, and Steve, had office jobs downtown. We found that 2-story house with a huge backyard, and at first we thought we'd gotten lucky. Cheap rent, a quiet neighborhood, the perfect place to enjoy life in our 20s without too many worries. The property was surrounded by an old wooden fence about 2 meters high, with a metal gate that connected to an alley between our street and the one behind it. We spent weekends having barbecues, playing music in the yard until late, and enjoying the feeling of freedom. The surrounding houses were mostly occupied by families or older couples who didn't bother anyone, which suited us perfectly. The first time we heard the banging was on a Tuesday at 2 in the morning. I remember it perfectly because I had stayed up late working on a project for a client in Japan. There were 3 heavy blows against the back gate, so intense they made the entire fence vibrate and the noise resonate through the yard. Jason stumbled out of his room with a baseball bat, and the 2 of us stood in the kitchen, our hearts racing, waiting for something else to happen. After about 5 minutes of silence, we thought maybe it had been some drunk kid from the nearby community college trying to take a shortcut through the alley. We laughed off the scare, cracked jokes about Jason's hero pose with the bat, and went back to sleep. But the next day it happened again. At the same time. The same 3 heavy knocks, followed by the metallic sound of someone manipulating the latch on the gate, pulling and pushing repeatedly. By the end of that week, the noises had turned into something much worse. We started hearing footsteps on the gravel along the side of the house, slow and deliberate, as if someone were calmly checking the property. Maria set her phone in her bedroom window one night to record, and we captured blurry images of 2 figures walking through the backyard, wandering between the shed and the patio furniture. They weren't trying to steal anything. They just walked and looked toward the windows, stopping for moments, observing. Steve wanted to call the police immediately, but the video was too dark to recognize faces, and technically they hadn't forced entry or caused damage. So we decided to install motion sensor lights, the kind that illuminate the whole yard when they detect movement. They were white LED lights of 3,000 lumens, so bright they could blind anyone. The Home Depot employee helped us choose the most annoying ones we had available, as he said with a laugh. That same Saturday afternoon, while Steve and I were up on ladders installing the new lights, we met the neighbors behind us for the first time. There were two men. They came out onto their terrace, which looked directly into our yard, and stood watching us in silence while we worked. The younger one looked to be in his 30s, with a scraggly beard, sunken cheeks, and a vacant stare. He scratched his arms compulsively and let out nervous giggles for no reason. The older one, around 50, wore a dirty yellow t-shirt hanging off a thin, bony body. He started asking us strange, disconnected questions, whether we had power tools to lend him, whether we knew where to get cheap car batteries, whether we worked with wires or something like that. None of it made sense. Their eyes had an unnatural sheen, tiny pupils despite the daylight, and both were covered in scabs on their skin, especially on their arms and faces. The smell coming from their house was almost unbearable, a mixture of chemicals, rotting garbage, and sour sweat. So strong it left a taste in the back of my throat even from several meters away. Steve tried to remain polite, giving vague answers while I limited myself to tightening screws, pretending to concentrate. Suddenly, the younger one got nervous, started walking in circles on the terrace, muttering about hidden cameras and LED lights the government used to read thoughts. Pure delirium. The older one let out a dry, hoarse laugh and told us we seemed like good guys. Then he added, "If you ever need something electronic fixed, I'm good at taking things apart." The way he said it made my hair stand on end. They went back inside after about 10 minutes, but we saw them through the picture window, standing in the dark, watching us while we finished installing the lights. That night, Maria looked up the property records online. She discovered that the house was rented by a company based in Nevada, with a history of complaints about noise, trash, and suspicious activities going back 3 years. The motion sensor lights worked perfectly for 2 nights. On the third, at 1 in the morning, they began turning on again and again every few minutes, flooding the backyard with a blinding white flash. We got up to look out the windows, and there was nothing. Just the empty yard and the fence's long shadows. Until we realized something. The lights had been turned, no longer pointing toward the fence, but toward the house, as if someone had moved them on purpose. Jason found fresh scratches on the metal housing and some greasy marks on the wall just below. It looked like someone had climbed up to tamper with them. We also noticed that the trash bins had been rifled through, with specific things missing. Old electronic devices, used batteries, pieces of copper wire that Steve had tossed days earlier from a repair project. At first, we didn't understand what sense that made, until Maria Googled it and discovered those items were used to make homemade meth pipes or were sold as materials to trade for drugs. From there, things got out of control. The following Thursday, everything became truly terrifying. It was 3 in the morning when Maria's scream from downstairs woke me up. I ran down and found her in the kitchen, trembling, her face completely pale. She had gone to get a glass of water and found the younger neighbor. Yes, the same one who had talked about LED lights in the government, standing in our backyard with his face pressed to the sliding glass door. He had his hands cupped around his eyes, trying to look inside. When Maria turned on the porch light, he didn't move. He just stayed there, motionless, staring at her, slowly swaying from side to side, his lips moving as if he were talking to himself. Maria started pounding on Jason's door, shouting his name. Only then did the man turn on his heel and start walking toward the fence. But he didn't use the alley gate. He tried to climb over it, snagging his t-shirt on the top and hanging there for a full minute, kicking and cursing, until he managed to rip the fabric and fall to the other side. This time we did call the police, but when they arrived almost 40 minutes later, the only thing they found was a strip of torn fabric at the top of the fence. The officers took a report, promised to increase night patrols, and repeated the same old speech. Keep your doors locked, avoid confrontations, stay vigilant. but deep down we knew they wouldn't do much more. The next morning, while I was working from home, I heard Steve shout from the yard. I ran out and saw him standing by the shed, padlock in hand. It was destroyed, not cut with a tool, but brutally beaten, bent and twisted. Inside, everything was ransacked. Our lawnmower was half disassembled, with the motor's copper coils torn out and gone. The gas can was missing too, as well as some cans of paint thinner, and inexplicably a box of rock salt that we used to make homemade ice cream. But the worst wasn't what they took, it was what they left behind. Behind where the mower had been, we found a glass pipe burned at one end with blackened residue, and next to it a filthy sleeping bag imbued with the same nauseating chemical smell that emanated from the house behind us. Steve, wearing gloves, stuffed it all into a trash bag, but it was already useless. We knew they had been using our shed as a hideout or a place to use, perhaps for weeks without us realizing. That weekend, we decided to confront the problem directly. The four of us, Jason, Maria, Steve, and I, went together to their house at noon, thinking that in broad daylight it would be safer. We knocked for almost 5 minutes before the older neighbor appeared. He wore only dirty, stained underwear, ribs visible beneath pale, mottled skin. The inside of the house was absolute chaos. Mattresses on the floor, aluminum foil covering the windows, burn marks on the carpet, and at least 6 people sprawled in different corners, some asleep, others barely conscious. The man insisted he didn't know anything about who had entered our yard, but his hands were shaking so much he could barely hold the door. I noticed recent scratches on his arms, the same kind I had seen on our fence. When Jason mentioned that we had security recordings and planned to press charges, the man changed completely. He started talking fast, almost without breathing, saying that we didn't understand the situation, that they were just trying to survive, and that his nephew, the younger one, sometimes got confused at night when he used too much. Before we could respond, 3 more people came out from the back of the house, including the nephew. He was unrecognizable. He had lost a lot of weight, rotting teeth, open sores on his face that looked infected. He started yelling at his uncle for talking to us, saying we surely carried microphones, that we had installed listening devices in their walls through the fence. Then he turned toward us, and suddenly his face changed. He adopted a calm, almost friendly expression and asked if we wanted to buy a motorcycle. When we said no, he asked if we had bicycles in the shed, that he could fix them and sell them. That was the definitive confirmation. He knew exactly what was in our shed. Maria lost her patience. She shouted that if anyone else from that house set foot on our property again, we would report them for trespassing and drug possession. The young man burst out laughing, a dry, chilling cackle. "You can't prove anything," he said. "Maybe you're the junkies trying to blame innocent people." The older man tried to calm him, but at that moment 2 more people came out of the house, pushing him aside to pass. One of them was carrying our gas can, still with Steve's initials written on it in black marker. That night was the worst, and luckily also the last. Around midnight, the crash of breaking glass woke us all up. Jason grabbed his baseball bat again while I called 911 with trembling hands. We went downstairs with our hearts in our throats and found the kitchen window completely shattered, a brick in the middle of the floor surrounded by shards of glass. Through the hole in the broken window, we saw something that froze our blood. The backyard shed was on fire. The fire spread quickly, the flames devoured the wooden structure, and thick black smoke rose in spirals into the night sky. As we stood there paralyzed, watching, the motion sensor lights turned on, revealing 5 or 6 figures running through the yard. Some were throwing objects into the fire. Others were trying to steal the patio furniture. Among them, I recognized the younger neighbor. He was shirtless, his body covered in blotches, dancing around the flames and howling like an animal. Steve ran out with the garden hose, trying to put out the fire, but the stream only reached a few meters. When he checked, he discovered that the hose had been cut into several sections precisely. By the time the firefighters arrived, the shed was already a mountain of ashes. The back fence was charred and the intruders had dispersed. Some ran toward their house, others fled through the alley. The firefighters explained to us that the fire patterns indicated the use of gasoline and paint thinner as accelerants. The strange color of the flames, bluish and green, was probably due to chemicals. Surely the same ones they used to manufacture methamphetamine. That same night, the police arrested 7 people from the house behind us, including the 2 neighbors we had been dealing with. It turned out they had set up a small methamphetamine laboratory in their bathroom, and the fire gave the authorities the perfect excuse to issue a search warrant. Inside, they found almost 1 kilo of methamphetamine, a portable cooking setup, stolen property from more than a dozen houses in the neighborhood, and 3 people with outstanding arrest warrants. The younger man tried to resist the officers and ended up being tasered in his own yard, shouting that we were CIA agents sent to destroy his research. We had to spend 3 days in a hotel while hazardous materials teams cleaned the chemical residue from the yard. The smell had permeated everything. Our landlord, upon learning what had happened, allowed us to break the lease without penalty, and we moved out in less than 2 weeks. 6 months later, I drove through the area. Both houses were empty, with condemned property notices posted on the doors. Sometimes I still dream of that young man's face, his face pressed against the glass of the door, his dead eyes staring at me from the darkness. And every time I wake up, before going back to sleep, I check all the locks twice. Story 4. It was a Thursday afternoon, late August, when everything started to go wrong. I was 16, had just started my junior year at Lincoln High in Raleigh, and my mom had left that morning for a 3-day nursing conference in Charlotte. She kissed me before leaving, repeating her usual list of warnings: to lock the doors, not to throw any parties, to call her if I needed anything. I rolled my eyes and told her I'd be fine, that I wasn't a kid anymore. Even so, the house felt different without her, bigger, emptier, as if the familiar corners had stretched and turned into strange places. I spent the morning playing video games and eating cereal straight from the box, enjoying the freedom of having the place all to myself. We lived in a quiet neighborhood in North Raleigh, the kind full of 2-story houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and a dog barking in the distance. Nothing ever happened there. It was around 2 in the afternoon when I heard knocking at the front door. I looked through the people and saw Mr. Garrison, who lived 3 houses down. He was a man in his early 40s, the kind my mother always called an exemplary neighbor. Always clean-shaven, in a polo and khakis, the type who helps you with grocery bags or offers to jump your car without you asking. He had that easy smile of men who always seemed to be in a good mood and used to wave to me when I ran past our house in the mornings. My mother talked about him constantly, how he fixed our mailbox when some kids smashed it, how he brought us cookies when we moved in 5 years ago. That day he was on the porch, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. When I opened the door, I noticed he was sweating more than usual, even though it wasn't hot. He had dark stains under the arms of his polo and kept wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Hey, champ," he said in a strange tone, an urgency I'd never heard from him. "Sorry to bother you, but my phone died and I locked myself out of my house. My wife won't be back for a few hours, and I have to make an important call about a job interview. Can I use your phone for a moment? It'll just be a minute, I promise." He raised his cell, showing me the black screen, and gave me his usual smile, though this time it didn't reach his eyes. I hesitated only a few seconds. In my head, I heard my mother warning me not to let anyone in when I was alone. But this was Mr. Garrison, the man who helped my mom with a flat tire last winter, the friendly neighbor who always asked how school was going. Besides, he looked genuinely desperate, and I figured a quick call couldn't hurt. I motioned him in and pointed to the landline in the kitchen. As I led him through the living room, I noticed he was walking differently, with short, stealthy steps, almost as if he were trying not to make noise. His eyes kept moving. They lingered on the family photos on the mantel, on the mail in the entryway, and even looked up toward the second floor, where the bedrooms were. "Nice house," he murmured, though he'd been inside before, when he helped my mom move the fridge into the garage. In the kitchen, he picked up the receiver, but didn't dial right away. He stared at the buttons as if he'd forgotten whom he needed to call, About 10 seconds passed. It felt like an eternity. Then he started dialing. I heard the beeps, but something sounded off. Too many digits, or maybe too few. I couldn't tell, because I was trying not to seem suspicious. The conversation was strange. He spoke softly, almost whispering, saying things like, "Yes, I know. I can't do it now. I need more time." He never mentioned an interview, nor did he sound like someone talking about work. It was a tense tone, almost conspiratorial. His free hand gripped the edge of the countertop so hard his knuckles went white, and on his wrist I noticed a red mark, a deep line, as if something had been tied there recently. When he hung up, about 90 seconds later, he turned to me with a forced smile. "Thanks, kid. Can I use your bathroom before I go?" he asked. I didn't have time to answer. He was already moving through the house, not toward the hall bathroom, but toward the laundry room by the back exit. "Actually, where's your back door? I'm going to cut through the yard if you don't mind." The way he said it made every hair on my body stand up. And right then there were 3 knocks on the front door. Loud, fast, authoritative. It wasn't a neighbor's knock. It was an order. Mr. Garrison froze and all the color drained from his face. Without a word, he ran to the laundry room and shut the door behind him. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I saw 2 silhouettes. I looked through the people and my heart started pounding in my chest. 2 police officers were there, hands on their belts, faces serious and alert. The 2 officers knocked again. The taller one, an African-American woman with her hair pulled back into a flawless bun, raised her voice. "Police department. We need to speak with whoever's inside." My mouth went completely dry. Mr. Garrison was hiding in my laundry room, and now the police were at my door. All the pieces, his sweat, the weird call, the mark on his wrist, snapped together in my head at once, forming a puzzle I didn't want to finish. I stood paralyzed for a few seconds that felt eternal, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Behind the laundry door, I could hear Garrison's ragged breathing, like he'd just run a marathon. The officers knocked a 3rd time, harder. "We know someone is inside," the woman said. "We saw movement through the window." My legs were shaking like rubber, but I managed to open the door with the security chain still on. "Yeah," I said, my voice cracking, sounding younger than I wanted. The male officer, a stocky white man with a graying mustache, raised his badge. "Kid, we're looking for a man who was seen in this neighborhood about 15 minutes ago. Robert Garrison. He lives a few houses down. Have you seen him?" The way he said it. "Have you seen him?" Not "is he here?" gave me a small opening. A chance not to become the kid who hid a fugitive in his house. "What did he do?" I asked, trying to sound curious as my mind raced for options. The 2 officers looked at each other, and the woman answered. "He's wanted for questioning in an embezzlement case. His company reported over $200,000 missing, and Mr. Garrison failed to show up to a meeting with investigators this morning. They found his car abandoned at a rest stop on I-40. She took out her phone and showed me a photo. It was him, but in a suit and tie, a common suburban dad face. He's not dangerous, but we need to locate him," she added. "His wife said he left home upset an hour ago." Not dangerous. That should have calmed me, but all I could think was that this man was breathing 5 meters away from me, hiding, and the police had no idea how close they were. I felt my palms sweating and discreetly wiped them on my jeans before answering. "No, I haven't seen him," I lied, feeling the words burn in my throat. "I've been home all day playing. I haven't looked outside much." The mustached officer leaned in a little. I could smell coffee and tobacco on his breath. "Do you mind if we take a quick look? Just to be sure." And I knew that was the critical moment. I could hear Garrison holding his breath behind the door, maybe with his ear pressed against it, waiting for my answer. "My mom isn't home," I blurted, "and she told me not to let anyone in when she's not here, not even the police. She's very strict about that." It wasn't entirely a lie. My mother had given me that rule. though she probably would have made an exception for 2 uniformed officers. The woman nodded slowly, though her eyes scanned every visible corner of the entryway through the gap in the chain. "Your mom is smart. All right then. Can we take her number? We want to talk to all the neighbors." I recited it, knowing my mother was in the middle of her conference and wouldn't pick up. The officer wrote it down, then handed me a card. "If you see Mr. Garrison, don't approach him. Call us right away, okay?" Then she looked at me intently, pinning me with her gaze as if she could read my thoughts. "Are you sure you're okay? You look nervous." I forced an awkward, totally fake laugh. "Yeah, I've never had police at the door. It's kind of scary, I guess." She watched me a few seconds longer, with an expression somewhere between suspicion and compassion, and finally stepped back. "Lock your doors and stay inside. There will be patrols in the area for a while." I watched them walk back to their car, a white patrol unit with the city emblem, and sit inside for a minute, probably verifying my mother's information. I remained still, my heart thundering, knowing Garrison was just a few yards away, listening to every word. When the patrol car turned the corner and disappeared, the laundry room door opened slowly. Mr. Garrison came out, unrecognizable. The friendly neighbor was gone. In his place stood a desperate, nervous, exhausted man, his polo soaked with sweat, hair disheveled, hands trembling as he ran them over his head. "You did good, kid." Very good, but it didn't sound like gratitude. It sounded like a cold assessment, as if he were deciding whether he could still trust me. He moved to the window, nudging the blinds open just a few millimeters to look out at the street. "I need you to do me one more favor. Lend me your bike from the garage, just for tonight. I'll bring it back, I swear." I knew perfectly well I'd never see it again, and I also knew I didn't have another choice. That man was no longer the helpful neighbor, but a cornered animal, and cornered animals do unpredictable things. "Take it," I said quietly. "Just please go." He looked at me a few seconds longer, and his expression shifted slightly, as if for an instant he became human again. "I'm not a bad person, you know. Sometimes good people make terrible mistakes, and those mistakes grow until you end up hiding in a teenager's house, running from the police." He went out the back door. I watched from the window as he took my bike from the garage, keeping to the shadows between the houses. Before he left, he turned and looked at me through the glass. He raised his hand in a sad farewell, a mix of guilt, shame, and defeat. Then he mounted up and disappeared down the alley, hunched over the handlebars like he wanted to make himself invisible. I stood in the silence of the house, adrenaline still racing through me, and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the 3rd ring, confused, worried. I told her everything: Garrison, the police, the bike. She left the conference immediately and called the police from the car. That same night, they found Mr. Garrison at a motel 2 towns over, still with my bike. The stolen money was never fully recovered, and his family moved away a month later. Sometimes I think about that afternoon, about how quickly someone familiar can become a stranger, and how a single moment of desperation can destroy an entire life. The new neighbors living in the Garrison's old house seem nice, but since then I never open the door when I'm home alone. Story 5. Most people dream of living in quiet neighborhoods with friendly faces and weekend cookouts, right? Well, let me tell you what happened on our little cul-de-sac last spring. Something that completely shattered that illusion for me and my family. I'm an electrician, 34, and I've lived in the same house in the Illinois suburbs for 6 years, with my wife and our 2 kids, 7 and 9. We moved there precisely because it seemed like the ideal place to raise children. 8 houses set in a circle, huge oaks lining the street, and neighbors who really did wave when they saw you pass by. The neighborhood had its own quiet, pleasant rhythm. Lawnmowers humming on Saturday mornings, kids playing street hockey until the streetlights came on, and impromptu get-togethers whenever someone fired up the grill. It was exactly the kind of life we were looking for when we left our small apartment in the city. Everything changed when Harold Garrison moved into the yellow house at the end of the circle, about 3 months before that terrible day in May. Harold was in his mid-50s, always wore faded polos tucked into khakis hiked up too high, and walked in a peculiar way, stopping every few steps as if he were counting something in his head. At first, we all tried to be friendly. My wife, Janet, even brought him a freshly baked casserole the first week, though he barely opened the door enough to take it. He never returned the dish, by the way. 2 weeks after moving in, Harold had installed 4 security cameras around his house. It seemed excessive, sure, but not entirely unusual. Paranoia had become pretty common lately, until we began to notice something more unsettling. Harold would stand in his driveway with an old camcorder, one of those early 2000s models with a flip-out screen, openly recording our houses for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. The first note appeared on a Monday morning, tucked under the wiper of Bill's pickup, my neighbor who lived 2 houses down. Bill was a good guy, worked construction, and had a habit of tapping his wedding ring against surfaces when he was thinking. That day he came up my driveway with the note in hand, his normally steady voice cracked by unease. The note was written in tight, aggressive handwriting with black pen, pressed so hard the paper had holes. It said his truck was too loud when it started at 5:30 a.m., that his diesel engine destroyed the peace and sanctity of the neighborhood, and that appropriate measures would be taken if it continued. The most unsettling part wasn't the tone, but the level of detail. Harold had noted the exact times Bill started his truck over the past 2 weeks, how long he let it idle, and even the license plate number, repeated 3 times at the end like an obsessive mantra. After that, the notes started showing up everywhere, and when I say everywhere, I mean it. Stacy, the neighbor on the far side of the circle, found one stuck to her mailbox complaining that her wind chimes created noise pollution and demanding their immediate removal. The Johnsons got one slipped through their mail slot, accusing them of placing their recycling bin at a geometrically offensive angle to the sidewalk. Even old Mr. Petrov, who'd lived there for decades and barely spoke to anyone, received a 2-page manifesto about how his tomato plants were attracting birds that were defecating on other people's property. Each note was more hostile than the last, with underlined words and exclamation points everywhere, like little soldiers of fury on the page. Harold even started adding bizarre diagrams, drawings of our houses with measurements and angles, printed photos with red circles marking supposed violations, and once a crayon illustration showing a person lying on the ground with X's over their eyes. We tried to handle it calmly at first. We really did. Bill and I decided to walk over to his house on a Saturday afternoon with a 6-pack as a peace offering, hoping to talk like adults. Harold opened the door wearing rubber gloves and a surgical mask, which should have been our first red flag. Through the crack, we could see metal filing cabinets from floor to ceiling, each labeled with our addresses on label maker tape. He didn't invite us in. He just stood there, breathing hard behind the mask, while we explained that his notes were making everyone uncomfortable. Then he pulled a little spiral notebook from his pocket and started reading aloud violations he'd observed that very morning. The angle of my mower stripes, the 17 times Bill's dog had barked, and even the suspicious ethnic odor coming from Mr. Petrov's kitchen. When we tried to reason with him, his face turned purple. He pointed a trembling finger at us and started shouting that we were all conspiring to kick him out, that he was the only one who cared about maintaining neighborhood standards. It all blew up that Wednesday in May, a day so humid and heavy you could practically chew the air. I'd gotten home early from work. An electrical install had been postponed, and was sitting on the porch thinking about how we might solve the Harold problem when I heard shouting from the Johnsons' yard. Their kids, 10-year-old twins, were playing with squirt guns. Just kids being kids, laughing, running across the lawn, enjoying the heat. But apparently a few drops had splashed onto Harold's driveway, and to him that was an unforgivable offense. By the time I got there, he was already standing way too close to the kids, a garden hose in one hand and a camcorder in the other. His face was a mask of pure, distorted rage mixed with something darker that made my skin crawl. He was yelling at them while spraying them with water, accusing them of not respecting boundaries, and their parents of failing to teach basic human decency. And all the while he was recording, pointing the camera at them as if he were documenting a crime. What happened next still haunts me. Mrs. Johnson ran out of the house, still in her bank clothes, hair down, heels sinking into the lawn. She stepped in front of her kids, shielding them with her body. And Harold aimed the hose at her and blasted her in the face, still filming with the other hand. But that wasn't what froze us. It was what he said. In a voice eerily calm, so different from his previous shouting it sounded like another person. He looked directly at the kids and said, "Your mother can't protect you forever. Boundaries exist even when parents aren't watching. I know your schedule. I know when you wait for the bus. Alone." That last word, alone, hung in the air like poison. Water was still running from the hose, soaking the ground, while he kept filming. Bill reached him before I did, rushed Harold, and twisted his wrist until he dropped the camera, which hit the ground and snapped with a dry crack. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, Stacy still in yoga clothes, Mr. Petrov with dirt-covered hands, even Martin, the night shift guy, stumbling out, disoriented. We formed a protective circle around the Johnsons while Harold stood there with his shirt soaked and his eyes empty and frantic. He alternated between shouting legal threats and muttering about evidence and conspiracies, as if he lived in a different reality. He tried to pull something from his pocket, some kind of pen camera, and when Bill yanked it away, Harold completely unraveled. He dropped to his knees on the grass, ripping clumps of it out with his hands and tossing them into the air, screaming that we were criminals, that he had files on all of us, that he knew things we didn't even know about ourselves. The police arrived in 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. 2 officers, a young guy who looked fresh out of the academy, and a veteran sergeant with a face weathered by experience. Harold tried to hand them his evidence, pulling a manila folder from inside his shirt. Soaked with sweat and water, pages spilling everywhere. There were photos of our houses with dates and times, transcripts of recorded conversations, and a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood with our daily routines traced in different colors. I watched the sergeant's expression shift from annoyance to horror when she found the pages dedicated to the children, with precise schedules of when they were home alone or waiting for the bus. She looked at her partner with that silent expression that means only one thing. This is much more serious than it looks. They arrested Harold right there, but before they put him in the squad car, he shouted something that still gives me goosebumps. As they cuffed him, he looked me straight in the eyes and in a sing-song voice like a nursery rhyme recited. "The electrician leaves at 7:23, returns at 5:47. Wife alone from 8:15 to 4:30. Kids wait for the bus at 7:45. No adult supervision for 6 exact minutes." The silence that followed was unbearable. The precision of his words, the way he had been watching us so closely, made me feel like my skin was too tight for my body. Even the young officer stopped writing for a moment, stunned, thinking the same thing as all of us. How long had he been recording our lives, and what did he plan to do with that information? Days later, the sergeant came back to the neighborhood to update us on the investigation. What she told us was chilling. She said going into Harold's house was like stepping into the mind of a control-obsessed person. In every room there were surveillance monitors showing footage from cameras we didn't even know existed. One hidden in fake rocks near gardens, another inside a birdhouse, and another disguised as a doorbell with enough coverage to see the entire circle of houses. He had filing cabinets for each family, with sections for each member. Our license plates, birthdays, schedules, even our kids' names. But the most disturbing thing was in the basement. They found a miniature model of the entire neighborhood made out of cardboard and popsicle sticks, with little figures representing each of us. He could move them, change their positions, as if he were playing God. Some figures had a red X painted on them, including the ones representing the Johnson twins. When we asked what those marks meant, the sergeant just clenched her jaw. She didn't have to say anything. Harold was charged with harassment, threats against minors, illegal surveillance, and other counts that, according to the prosecutor, would keep him away for several years, maybe more depending on the psychiatric evaluation. But even now, months later, the neighborhood was never the same. We all installed new locks, alarm systems, and yes, security cameras. The irony isn't lost on us. The Johnsons moved out in September. They said they couldn't stand looking at their yard without remembering Harold with the hose and the camera. The rest of us stayed, but there's a quiet tension among us, as if we're all waiting for something to go wrong again. Sometimes I catch myself checking the rearview mirror more than necessary when I pull away from the house, wondering if someone is taking note of the exact time. 7:24, not 7:23. The yellow house at the end of the circle is still empty, with a for sale sign so faded it's almost unreadable. No one has come to see it. I suppose word travels fast about houses like that, places where something broke in a way you can't see but everyone can feel. Story 7. I lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where everyone greets each other in passing and the days seem to blend into a predictable routine. At that time, I worked long hours in a small accounting office, leaving home early and coming back late at night. My life was simple. Wake up, drive to work, buy groceries, repeat. I didn't socialize much with my neighbors, but I knew them by sight. One of them, however, always caught my attention. Mr. Howard, an older man who lived 2 houses down. He was retired and spent most of his time sitting on his porch with a thermos in his hand, watching the street as if it were his personal television. At first, it didn't bother me. I thought maybe he was bored, that keeping an eye on the neighborhood gave him something to do. But little by little, I noticed an unsettling pattern. He always appeared right when I was leaving or returning. No matter the time. I could go out at dawn, at noon, or at midnight. He was there, sometimes seated, sometimes walking around casually, as if his presence were mere coincidence. It was strange enough to unsettle me, but not enough to confront him. I tried to convince myself it was just that, a coincidence. Even so, that uncomfortable feeling began to grow day by day. One night I got home later than usual, close to midnight. The neighborhood was completely silent, and the air was still. As I parked the car, I saw him. Mr. Howard was in his yard, not on the porch. His posture was different, rigid, upright, looking directly at my car. When the headlights lit him for an instant, he didn't startle or look away. He stayed still, as if he had been waiting for me. I stayed in the car for a few seconds, debating whether to greet him or pretend I hadn't seen him. Finally, I went inside without saying a word and locked the door. I couldn't sleep that night. It wasn't just the idea that he was out there. It was the feeling that he knew exactly what time I would be back. The next morning, as I left for work, I instinctively looked down the street. And yes, there he was again, leaning on the porch railing, drinking from his dented thermos, his eyes fixed on me. When I got into the car, he gave me a slight nod, courteous but unsettling. That was the moment I stopped believing in coincidences. Over the next week, the idea of being watched began to consume me. I tried to break the pattern. I left earlier, came back later, even made up excuses to go out at different times of day. But no matter when, he was always there. Sometimes on the porch, other times by the mailbox, fiddling with imaginary letters. One night I saw him trimming his hedge in the dark. No flashlight, no light. And he only stopped when I started the car. Then he went back into his house with complete calm. It was no longer odd. It was intentional. And I couldn't stop thinking, how did he always know when I was going out? The following Saturday, I decided to test my theory. I turned off all the lights in the house, left the car parked a street away, and kept watch from the living room window. Hours passed. Nothing out of the ordinary. Him sitting on the porch. The same ritual as always. But when I slipped quietly toward my driveway, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Right above his garage, between the siding and the gutter, there was a small black device pointed directly at my driveway. The faint reflection of the porch in the lens confirmed it. It was a camera. My chest tightened. There was the explanation. It wasn't intuition. He was watching me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a security camera for his own yard. But the angle disproved that. It wasn't aimed at his garden. It was aimed at my car and my front windows. I went back inside, drew the curtains, and started pacing, my stomach churning. Confronting him didn't seem safe, but ignoring it made me sick. I thought about calling the police, but I imagined how it would sound. An elderly man with a camera across from my house. I was afraid they'd think I was paranoid, but I couldn't forget that lens. So still, so precise, aiming at my life like the barrel of a gun. I lived the next few days like someone under surveillance. I checked the locks 2 and 3 times, moved around with the curtains closed, and parked in different places to throw him off. One night I barely saw a red glow on the camera, the recording light. Thinking he might be in his living room, watching every move of mine live made my skin crawl. It was no longer just annoying. It was an absolute invasion. At last, the next weekend, I couldn't take it anymore. I called a friend from work, Daniel, who knew a bit about home security. I asked him to come take a look. We stood in my driveway pretending to have a casual chat, while he looked up at Mr. Howard's garage. After a few seconds, he murmured, "That's a camera. It's not even well hidden. And yes, it's aimed right at your house." Hearing it from someone else sent a chill through me. It was no longer a suspicion. It was real. I was being spied on. That same night, I called the non-emergency police line. 2 officers came, listened to my account, and then went to talk to him. I watched from the window while they spoke. Mr. Howard gestured, pointed at the street, shook his head. One of the officers pointed to the camera, and after a few tense minutes, they removed it from the garage. When the officers came back, they explained that he said it was for neighborhood security, but since it invaded my property, they ordered him to remove it immediately. They suggested I install my own cameras if I wanted to feel safer, and they left. The next few days were uncomfortable. I still saw him outside with his thermos, pretending to water dry plants or check an empty mailbox, but there was no longer a camera pointed at me. And with that, the air became a little lighter. He never apologized. He never mentioned the incident. But his presence lost power. I kept the curtains closed, avoided any eye contact, and little by little his perfectly timed appearances at my departure hours began to diminish. Maybe he knew he'd been found out. Or maybe he simply lost interest once his little toy was taken away. Either way, the silence returned to the neighborhood. Sometimes years later, I still think about that time and how easy it is to cross the line between neighborhood watch and predatory control. There were no threats or violence, but it taught me how fragile privacy is. Every time I see a small black lens on the front of a house, I can't help wondering who it's aimed at and what story the person behind the lens is telling themselves to justify it. For me, that tiny device changed the way I look at my own home forever.